Parents, let me just ask you a question. Have your kids ever not appreciated your discipline? Yeah, right? You're the parent. You're the person of wisdom. You know that if they get in that laundry hamper and slide down the stairs, the potential for injury is great, right? But they thought that you were wrecking their fun, right? But luckily now, since video cameras are like everywhere, some of their worst moments are captured on video. Watch this.
What are you doing?
You said you don't love me,
Doctor, I never said I didn't love you.
Yes, you did.
I said turn off your PlayStation, it's time for bed. It's not the same thing, get in here. And how are you gonna run away with a Minecraft sword and a skateboard? Come on, get back in here. Go.
You don't love me. I didn't say I didn't love you. I said turn off your PlayStation, it's time for bed. Same thing. Sometimes kids don't appreciate their parents' discipline. So question for you, does God discipline his kids? It's a great question. If you're a Christian, then you're one of his kids, right? Let me just ask in the same vein, do we not appreciate God's discipline of us? Should we expect him to discipline us? I mean, this leads to all kinds of questions for me. But I want you to see where this question comes from. So I want you to do this. Turn to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4. Keep your Bible open. Let me explain where this comes from, though. We've been in this series called Old Testament Heroes, where we've been looking at the book of Judges. And in Judges, there's these stories of these men and women who God used, and they were called judges. God used them to help rescue God's people from suffering. They were suffering because God intentionally allowed them to be overrun by their enemies. This is how it reads in Judges chapter 6, verse 1. We read this last week. This is Gideon's story. It starts with this. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. So for 7 years, God allowed pain to come into the lives of his people for the purpose of discipline. But in Judges, if you remember the cycle of chaos, this happened over and over and over again because God, the Israelites would kick God out of their lives and be like, God, we're just not going to follow you. We just don't want anything to do with you. And God's like, okay, that's fine. I'm going to remove my protection and blessing from your life. And then the Israelites realize, oh, life without God is not really what we want. Question. Does God still allow hardship into our lives for the purpose of getting our attention? For the purpose of refining our character? Man, it just leads to a whole group of questions for me. So if God does discipline his kids, how does God want us to respond to discipline? Are hardships always God's causing it? Or maybe sometimes hardship is the pain of our natural consequences or poor choices. Or maybe hardship is actually other people's poor choices forced on us. Does God cause some pain or does he just allow it? Is God's discipline the only way that I get to grow up? I mean, I told you I got questions about this, but I have questions because I think you have questions about this too. Do you think you've ever experienced God's discipline in your life? So to find our answers, we have to go to the New Testament because that's the covenant that you and I live in. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4. Last week we looked at verses 1 through 3. And then the writer goes immediately into verse 4 into this discussion about how God disciplines his kids. And so here's what I'm going to do this morning. I want to read this section to you, verses 4 through 11, in its entirety so you have the big picture view. And then we're going to go back through and I'm going to give you 4 things in this passage that I think will answer some questions. Here it is. Verse 4. In your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you're not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you're not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. There's our text. God, speak to us and give us wisdom. The first question, does God still discipline his kids? Absolutely. I mean, it's right here in the text. But in this text, he gives us 4 truths. Now, let me just point them out to you right off the bat. He gives us the encouragement. He also gives us the challenge. He gives us the reason for his discipline and the result of his discipline. But we're going to look at these 4 truths by asking questions. Here's my next question. Are there unproductive ways, or what are the unproductive ways of handling hardship? Because the reality is we haven't handled it well at times. Here's the first one. I'm going to put this in my words. Let me give you the text. In my words, it's this. Don't complain, it could be worse. This is what he says, verse 4. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. Now, when I first read this when I was younger, I was like, I don't understand this verse. Because I thought it was about my sin, me resisting my own sin. I haven't resisted my own sin nature enough that I've shed blood. And it's like, it just made no sense to me. But get this is verse 4, right? The context of it is actually up in verse 3, and verse 3 reads this way. Consider him, he's referring to Jesus, consider Jesus who endured such opposition from sinners. That's the sin he's talking about. So that you will not grow weary and lose heart. It's about you experiencing a hardship because of somebody else's sin and opposition of you. And he's actually already addressed this in the previous chapter, in chapter 10, verse 32. Just listen to this. He says, remember those early days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. See, it's about this conflict that this writer is writing to of this church of mostly Jewish Hebrew Christians. And he's saying, you haven't yet shed blood. You haven't even got a bloody nose over the opposition that's been facing you. So be careful in complaining about it because it could be worse. Now, pay attention to this. Just caveat here. Stay with me because there's some of you in this room, you've experienced hardship and pain in your life, and I don't want to minimize that. And so pay attention to this. This writer didn't actually write this to you in your personal situation. He wrote this to this Jewish Christian church. And so be careful in just taking one verse and getting offended by it. It's not to be offensive. But I think he is saying, listen, you at that church, you haven't even shed blood yet. He goes on to write this, verse 5. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? That word forgotten. I just know that sometimes the best advice of how not to deal with things is don't leave God out of your pain. Sometimes in our pain, we just run from it. We just don't want to deal with it. And we leave God out of it. Sometimes we run to God. That's where he wants you to go in your pain. But sometimes we just get angry. We get vengeful. We get sad. We try to distract ourselves from our pain instead of saying, God, what do you want to teach me in this pain? He goes on to say this, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. There's one part of it, one extreme. Don't make light of it. And then do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Here's my point. Don't minimize the hardship. That's one way of getting it wrong. Don't blow it off. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. Don't kind of throw your hands in the air and be like, hey, life gives you lemonade sometimes, right? No. That means you're not learning anything. On the other extreme of that, though, don't get overwhelmed by the hardship. I mean, don't curl up in a ball on the floor and be like, God, this is too much for me. I give up. I mean, what does he say? Don't lose heart. And because of this, and here's where the encouragement comes in, ready? Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone that he accepts as his son. So here's his encouragement to you, these two things. God's discipline is a sign of his love. And his discipline is actually a sign that you belong to him. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but have you ever been to Chuck E. Cheese? Don't raise your hand. And you watch someone else's kid have a meltdown, right? They threw a temper tantrum and just freaked out. What did you do when you saw someone else's kid throw a fit? Nothing, right? Why? It's not your kid. And you just said a quiet prayer, thank God for my kids. Thank God that's not my kid. But if that was your kid having a total meltdown and having a bad attitude, what would you do? It's not nothing, right? Because you love Junior so much, you're going to step into Junior's world in a kind of forceful way so that Junior might grow up knowing that there's better ways to handle those things. There's a maturity to life so that they will change and have a different kind of character. It's a sign of your love for them, right? As a parent, it's so easy to understand. But as a kid, as God's kid, do we sometimes go, God, why are you disciplining me? And we fail to realize how much he loves us. So don't miss the encouragement. The encouragement is this, that you are loved by God and you belong to him when hardship comes. Because sometimes I think hardship is the only way that God will transform us, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So here's the challenge. If that is the encouragement, here's the challenge, and this is the question that I'm asking. What if I pray and I don't get relief from my hardship? And let's be just really honest. That's what we want when it comes to pain. We want relief. We want it to be over. But God's challenge is this, and it's very short. It just says this, endure hardship. Endure hardship, verse 7, as discipline. God is treating you as his children. I mean, this is a command. Endure it, hang in there, and don't give up. When I was just a little tyke, I was probably 4 or 5. I may have been a rather mischievous kid. I know that's hard for you to believe. But I just remember this moment when I was about 4. I don't even remember what I did. I just remember the moment that I was caught. And my mom was sitting on the edge of her bed, and she said, we need to talk. And I knew where this was headed. This was headed for a spanking. And in my 4-year-old mind, I just knew that my best option was to make a run for it, right? So I shook free, and I bolted out the door. Now, my parents' house was laid out in a circle, and so I ran out the door, and I made the left-hand turn because I would have hit a wall, made a left-hand turn, sprinted. And I knew she was right behind me. I could hear her. I mean, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, but I knew that if I turned around in my 4-year-old mind, I would lose speed. Speed was critical at this moment. I made the next left-hand turn through the living room, hurdled the coffee table. I knew that if I could just make the next left-hand turn, I'd be on the back straightaway, known as the hallway. There's no way she's keeping up with me. I'm lightning fast as a 4-year-old. And I get past the third curve, and I make it down the hallway, and I just know that she is right behind me. And I get to the 4th curve, and this moment is like cemented in my memory. You know, there's just some things you cannot forget as a kid. I came around that 4th curve, and my speed was so great, my brakes failed me at that moment because she hadn't moved. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, and I had just run around the house, and like Elastigirl, she's like, whoom, reaches out, extends her arm, pulls me in. It's like, oh, this is going to be worse now. And I endured that spanking. But truth be told, many of us, we would rather run than endure hardship. And this is his challenge for you. Endure it. Well, why? It leads to this next question. And the question is, can God actually be trusted? Can you trust God when he brings hardship into your life? I was really, really fortunate growing up because I grew up with parents who hugged me. I grew up with parents who told me, I love you. I grew up with parents who gave me boundaries like flaming hot Cheetos is not a breakfast. So I was really, really fortunate because I never really doubted the fact that my parents loved me. So when they disciplined me, I trusted that they were doing it for my good. So here's the reason for God's discipline. It's because God is a good father. In the text, halfway through verse 7, for what children are not disciplined by their father? If you're not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father's spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good. Underline that. God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. I love how the scriptures here, they point to our parents and how they disciplined us. Because can I be honest? I mean, often we look at God the same way we look at our parents. And some of you, you might not have had the benefit of parents who had a lot of tools and had a high emotional intelligence, who gave you a great experience. You might have grown up in an abusive situation. And so when I say you can trust God that he has your good in store, you're like, no, I'm not sure, because you look at God the same way you look at your parents, and you're not really sure if you can trust him. If I can maybe give you a couple thoughts on that. When we look at our parents, oftentimes they're the excuse for a lot of our feelings and our misgivings in life, right? I mean, isn't that where a lot of our thoughts come from? And like, oh, you know what? This is why I am the way I am. It's my mom. It's my dad, right? But here's a thought for you. Maybe they're just doing the best they could with the tools they had. I'm not making excuses for them, particularly if it was abusive. But when God gives us parents, the design is that they would parent us the same way that God does. They disciplined us a little while, doing the best while they thought what they thought best. Sometimes, honestly, they might have had wrong motives. They might have disciplined you to make themselves look better. It's a wrong motive. Maybe they had a wrong attitude. And parents, maybe you would admit this. I would admit this freely. Sometimes I disciplined my kids out of anger. You might be horrified. Oh, never. Yeah. You say things like, this is going to hurt me more than it does you. No, not really. This one might even, never mind. Sometimes our parents had the wrong method, right? The penalty didn't fit the crime. Maybe it was too severe. Truth be told, maybe it wasn't severe enough. And they just were like, you just did wrong, but whatever, I'm tired of disciplining you. But doesn't that feel like they're not just giving up on disciplining you, they're actually giving up on you? Sometimes our parents didn't get it right, but the truth is, God never gets it wrong. Here's the scripture. But God disciplines us for our good. Let me ask you another question. If I don't have hardship in my life, is actually God absent from my life? If you're not experiencing hardship, you're like, man, it is good. My job is good. My relationship is good. My kids are actually really well behaved. Like, is God then absent from my life? And let me say it this way. In the scriptures, we are not to pursue hardship. It's not a pursuit of ours. We're to pursue Jesus, but when we pursue Jesus, hardship is not far behind. Last week, we looked at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, where it says, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Get to know Jesus. Follow him. You don't have to pursue hardship. If you're following Jesus, hardship is going to show up. Next question, is God's discipline the only way for me to mature? Because we just sit back and be like, all right, God, here I am. Spanking coming. Here it goes. Are you just waiting for the next hardship? Listen to this. 1 Timothy 4:7. Train yourselves to be godly. You, Christian, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. So this is what I think this says. We can pursue spiritual maturity, or God can pursue it for us. How do you pursue spiritual maturity? Well, through what's called spiritual discipline. These are practices that stretch our thinking, help our understanding, grow our hearts, help us with self-control. I'll give you a couple examples. Prayer is the spiritual discipline of living in God's presence so we don't live like God doesn't exist and we don't ignore him. I mean, that was a problem of the Israelites, right? The spiritual discipline of fasting is the ability to say no so that our cravings don't control us. The spiritual discipline of giving is the ability to be generous so that our stuff doesn't control us. Our maturity can actually come by self-imposing spiritual disciplines in our lives. Next question. Does God cause hardship? Does God allow hardship, or does he just use the hardship that comes into our lives? It's a great question. I'm going to answer this by telling you just 3 quick stories, giving you 3 quick examples. King David, remember him in the Old Testament? King David, king of Israel, had an affair. In order to cover it up, he had the husband killed. The consequences of that was this. The child that was born out of that affair died. David then had turmoil and violence in his family. His family was broken for years. His own sons turned against him. So his story, I think, says this. David endured self-inflicted hardship. If you're in your notes, here it is. He endured self-inflicted hardship by his own poor choices that God used to correct. David's pain was self-inflicted. God was in the midst of that. But David was in the wrong and he needed correcting. And sometimes God's discipline of us, it begins by our own poor choices. But God does it to correct us. And I think Psalm 119:67 applies here. It says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray. But now I obey your word. It was good for me to be afflicted," verse 71, "so that I might learn your decrees." So is everyone who faces hardship, are they in the wrong? Have they sinned? And is God trying to correct them? Well, it's not the only story in the scriptures. Take Job's story. In the book of Job, here's how the story starts. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Job didn't do anything wrong. Job didn't sin. If you know his story, God allows Satan to put pain and hardship and suffering in Job's life. Job's friends look at him and they see all the suffering that Job is going through and they're like, "Job, listen, you did something wrong. You offended God. God is punishing you." And Job's like, "I am innocent. I didn't do anything wrong." In the very end of the book of Job, it reads this way. This is chapter 42, verse 3. "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now, after all my suffering, but now my eyes have seen you." Through suffering, Job knew God in a whole different way. So let me say it this way, and this is in your notes. Job endured others-inflicted hardship. His suffering was caused by Satan, and it was caused by his friends who misunderstood the pain he was going through, that God used to instruct him. He had a whole new relationship with God afterwards. Sometimes hardship is self-inflicted, and God uses it to correct us, and sometimes it's others-inflicted, and God uses it to instruct us and grow us. Here's a third story real quick. Paul. Remember his story? He writes about this pain that he had in his life, and he called it his thorn in the flesh, and some people don't know what it is. Some people thought it was like a relationship conflict that he had with the church. Most commentators, scholars, think that it was a physical ailment that he had. And this is what he writes about it in 2 Corinthians 12:7. He says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited," get this, he just talked about all these revelations and things that God had shown him and the powers that God had given him. And he says this, "So that I don't become conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, take it away from me. But he said, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So Paul says, therefore, I'm going to boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So what was God doing? Don't miss this. Paul's hardship was God-inflicted. God did it. And he used it to protect Paul. I don't have any other way of interpreting that. Sometimes, don't miss this, hardships are self-inflicted. We just make poor choices. We suffer natural consequences, but God can use those to correct us. Sometimes our hardships are inflicted on us by other people, but God can use that to instruct us. And there's moments where God will inflict hardship on us himself to protect us. Now look at me. Those three answers are not the only answers out there and is not all-encompassing. It's just three quick stories I'm giving you. So be careful. Be careful taking one of those and going, oh, that pastor's talking to me right now. That's me. Go before God. God, what are you teaching me? Particularly if you're experiencing a really painful hardship right now, which brings me to this final question, and we'll wrap up with this. Why does God allow hardship in my life? Like, what's the result? What is the thing that God is trying to accomplish in my life by bringing hardship there? And this is the final verse, and if I could focus your attention on anything, it's verse 11. This is how the writer of Hebrews wraps this section up. He says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time. And everybody said, yeah, but painful. Later on, however, and notice that later on, maybe you need to underline that because you're in the middle of your hardship right now. And God doesn't promise you that you're always going to understand it in the beginning of it, in the middle of it, but it says this, later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace, those two things, for those who've been trained by it. So here's the result. This is the thing that God is trying to do in your life. It is character formation and a quiet soul. See, pain alone doesn't produce character formation. And pain alone doesn't actually produce the peace, a quiet soul. Pain just hurts. But if you look at that text, I mean, what did it say? For those who've been trained by it. When pain is received by us as something that we can learn from, received by us as something that we can endure, when received by us as something that God can use for our good, even though it doesn't feel good in the midst of it, when it's received by us as something to be learned from, as a training for us, it will produce righteousness and peace in your life. I think sometimes we look at Bible words and we're like, righteousness, peace, blah, 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 blah. Well, what is it? I'm going to call it character formation. And the truth is we long for this. Because without character formation, we don't think, feel, or act like God. And it leaves a wake of destruction behind us with people. And it makes us want to hide from people that we can't show them our authentic self because the formation of our authentic self is not happening. And so therefore we have to hide from people. Instead of being transparent and free. Are you free with people? Because God, he's not done with you yet, and you're not free with people because you're perfect. You're just free with people because you know that God has his hand on your life. You don't have to hide from folks. The result that God is trying to bring about in you and me is character formation, and it's a sign that he's our loving Father. We don't live with shame anymore. The second result is this peace. Imagine it this way, that when the disciples get into the boat, you've heard these stories again and again, and the storm came up, and they're all freaked out. They think they're going to die. And Jesus is walking on the water. He gets into the boat, and he says, quiet. And the storm. And the boat stops rocking. I think that's the picture of what he can do in your own soul. There might be hardship and turmoil, but there is a quiet soul that can rest in him, even though the world around us is chaotic, and the world around us is chaotic. I think you and I think everybody longs for that quiet soul. So we have a choice. Here it is, wrap this up. We can avoid hardship and remain spiritually underdeveloped and immature. It's a choice of ours. Or we can embrace our own spiritual disciplines, right? Start embracing these spiritual disciplines that will help us grow up. And when hardships come your way, and you don't have to pursue the hardship, it'll come though. When they do come, pause. Stand in the midst of it. Endure it. Trusting that God is a good, good Father and loves you and you belong to him. And when that happens, know this. He's forming his character in you. And if you really trust him in the midst of that, there is a sense of peace and a quiet soul that people are going to look at you and go, what's different about you? And you can tell them, I got a loving Father, and I trust him that he's working in my life, around my life, and he's my strength. That's the kind of people that God wants us to be. Let's bow our heads. Let's pray. If you would close your eyes for just a moment, I'll just say this. If you're in a season of hardship right now, and it's been long, and maybe your pain has been great, I just want to say this. Please be careful in thinking that my words today have tried to explain everything about pain and suffering. It is not. You may have more questions for God, and I would encourage you, come to him and ask him, God, help me. Change me, work on me. God, give me your peace. And I will tell you this, God doesn't always answer with a clear, this is why. But he answers us with a clear, you can trust me. So Lord, I pray today for those who are struggling. We believe, God, that we don't always get to see why. But I believe in the midst of our struggle, you will always show your goodness. So God, we turn to you today. In the moments of our hurt, give us the courage to turn to you. Give us eyes to see how we can grow. And give us a quiet soul that really, truly trusts in you. And everybody said,